The economy. It's the backbone of your entire country. Without a good economy, you can't build troops. And if you can't build troops, you can't defend yourself. And if you can't defend yourself, you might as well just beg for mercy. Or mass scorch. Don't do that. So, I am guessing you're wondering why I am doing another economy guide. I did one like 2 years ago, but that one just explained the basic mechanics of the game. So if you're a complete newbie to the game, I recommend watching that video first before this one, since the game really hasn't changed that much in 2 years. This video will mainly be focusing on a powerful early game setup and its variations for decently strong nations. And it will also focus on corruption, plus some tips and tricks on how to manage your economy, aka an advanced economy guide. So I'm going to be skipping the basic mechanics. I have also kinda done an economy guide for smaller and micro nations, so I'd also recommend that video, and of course subscribing, since a lot of you aren't actually subscribed. So if you just took your time to click a button, it would be really helpful. Anyways, let's get on with the powerful early game setup and the advanced economy guide. I don't really have a name for the setup and its variations, but if I had to name them, it'd be something like Tank Spam Rush or War Economy. Yeah, I'm not good at naming things, as you can see. I'll first go over the most optimized version of the setup, and then some variations if the nation you want to play as doesn't fulfill the requirements necessary to use this setup. And the requirements to be able to do this setup as optimized as possible is the following. It requires at least one micronation as your neighbor, a chief judge at the beginning, some square cities for tanks, and a lot of micromanaging in the beginning. Don't worry if it's too fast, as I will be explaining why I do certain things. Enough talking. Here's the setup. The first thing you want to do upon joining is choose the chief judge in the leaders tab. I will show variations later on if you don't manage to get a chief judge in the beginning, since it's not completely necessary. However, as we all know, sometimes you just have a really bad day and get super unlucky and can't get a single chief judge. Getting it in the beginning just ensures you don't spend an entire game blindly hoping to win the lottery. After you've picked a chief judge, you want to justify on the micronation that is close to you and another smaller nation. If you have 2 micronations, then great, you can attack them both at the same time. But for this showcase, I'm going to be using Germany, and they only have 1 close micronation. You then want to go into the policy tab and get the ignore safety regulations policy for that incredible minus 20% building cost and plus 35% factory output. This is why we chose the chief judge. Thanks to this policy, we can build 1 fertilizer, 1 electronic, 1 steel, and 1 motor factory in all of our biggest cities. You can then choose between an aircraft factory or a civilian factory for your 5th factory. It doesn't really matter since you're going to be declaring and invading your micronation, and with the money you just earned, you will build in total 4 civilian factories for now. Did you notice where specifically I built the civilian factories? I built them on the less populated cities compared to my other factories, and the reason is quite simple. It's because of the infrastructure development cost. Since consumer goods is such a big part of our country, we will want a lot of them. Don't worry, the benefits far outweigh the negatives. We only lose a few 100,000 in resource income, but if we just simply improve infrastructure by 1, which is more than 10 times cheaper compared to improving on a square city, we gain 6 consumer goods, and those consumer goods provide much more than the resource income we lost. We can also keep improving infrastructure later in the game, so see this as a long-term investment, since you'll be needing more and more consumer goods the bigger you get. And you don't really want to get communism for factory output, since communism kinda sucks. If you are a decently big nation, you can put your taxation to max at the beginning of the game, and then also get 1 more motor factory now. Remember to put taxation back to normal though, so your stability doesn't dry out. Also remember to buy all the necessary resources. I personally like to buy 1 extra for each resource, in case the trade gets cancelled later on. That way my factory doesn't just go red immediately. Now we are going to invade the small nation we justified on. But if you justified on 2 micronations, you would invade the other one at the same time you attack the first one. Just split your home guards in 2 and spawn a few troops if the stack is below 60k. After you've conquered and taken the treasury, we finally want to build 3 more civilian factories, and with the excess money we have, we can finally start spamming tanks and attacking our neighbors. However, if you couldn't build 1 more motor factory before, you'll want to do it now. And finally, the consumer goods factories should be built. I will drop a link in the description on how many consumer goods each AI country will accept, but you will basically want to sell everything. That's the most efficient way this setup can go. You save the research power you would have used on factory output 2, and you also just speedrun consumer goods before anyone else. You can also focus your economy on increasing political power gain, so you can get nationalism really quickly, if you are planning on a quicker game. Now, for the variations. The first variation I'll go over is without a chief judge. I'll go into more detail on why a chief judge is important later on in the corruption section, but for now, let's just do the variation. You will basically want to do the exact same thing I did, but you can choose between 3 different options. The first option is to remove your ignore safety regulations policy after you've built all the factories, and then getting an extra motor and fertilizer factory. So that makes it 3 motor and 2 fertilizer factories in total. This way you can keep up all your consumer good factories without the extra 35% factory output modifier. But you might need to improve your infrastructure on the consumer goods factories. The second option is to do the same thing, but instead of building 2 more factories, you get factory output 2 in the research tab. This one is the least mentally consuming to do, but you lose a lot of research points that can be used somewhere else in the beginning, like political power or just more research. The third option is keeping the ignore safety regulations policy, but increasing your anti-corruption spending. I recommend this option, since you can improve infrastructure on the cities with your civilian factories and also build 1 extra motor and the fertilizer factories later on, which finally leads you to be able to safely remove the policy without any repercussions. And this is what you want to do anyways, since you'll want to use your corruption on other better policies. You only want to use ignore safety regulations when you are going to develop. It is not necessary to have it on at all times. Those are the different options for the first variation. The second variation is a different combination of factories. I don't really recommend this. Only if you can't really handle the amount of micromanaging that is required for the optimized setup. For this variation, you want to build 4 electronic factories and 1 steel factory instead of 1 of each one. Then, after you have invaded your micronation, you want to build 1 of each factory listed on the screen. And after the second nation is conquered, you want to build 3 more civilian factories. And here's why I don't really recommend this setup. You have to sell 5 electronics to a lot of AI countries, since they don't accept above 5. It's just going to be a race with other countries in the server, since you will all be finishing building the factories at the same time. Plus, there's so much less electronics compared to the amount you earn from consumer goods. Yeah, this variation just gets very annoying. Well, that's basically the setup and its variations. But now, we begin the fun part of the economy guide. Corruption. You see, corruption, yeah, it's horrible, but all the best modifiers in this game comes with a sprinkle of corruption game. So how do we abuse it? First, we have to know what reduces corruption. We have the anti-corruption spending, which gets really expensive the bigger your population is. So I don't really recommend using this beyond the first 2 boxes, since the cost doubles for each one. Then we have some research boxes. You'll most likely want to go for these first after getting quantum, or getting them first if you're not planning on playing a longer game, since they are the ones that reduce corruption gain. The corruption gain also increases the bigger your population is. And finally, we have the chief judge, the most cost efficient. It just costs around 0.3 political power to upkeep, which is incredibly cheap for the amount of corruption it reduces. This is why this little guy is so important. It allows us to pick between 2 very good corruption policies if you also manage to get one of these research boxes. But that's not the main reason why it's so good. The main reason why you want a chief judge is because of events. The setup I showed you a few minutes ago was all so you could spam tanks and invade really quickly in the game. While you're invading, you will obviously gain a lot of population. That's where events come in. The events we want to focus on in particular is corporate dealing, backdoor arms contract, political maneuvering, research intervention, and exclusive military contracts. The first two, corporate dealing and backdoor arms contract, is pretty self-explanatory. In exchange for a tiny bit of corruption, 10 or 8, just flat out, you get a sum of money dependent on your population, which can easily reach in the billions if you just simply invade a lot, like half of Europe, which can be done in just a few years. You pretty much always want to accept these events, except before you've gotten your first ideology, which is usually nationalism if you're doing the setup I showed. 10 or 8 corruption is pretty much nothing and can easily be reduced to 0 if you have a chief judge. The political maneuvering event is pretty much the opposite of the first two I mentioned. You only want to accept this before you've gotten your first ideology. After you've conquered a lot of stuff, the amount of money you need to spend for just 75 political power will keep increasing, so taking it as early as possible makes it so you spend as little as possible. 75 political power also has the biggest effect the earlier you are into the game, so it could be an insane start if you do get it early, but later on it's just too expensive. The corruption you get is 10, but like I mentioned earlier, it's not the end of the day, since all these 5 events I listed have a random chance of happening, and it's unlikely they spawn at the exact same time, so that 10 corruption can get to 0 before you get another one of these 5 events. For the event research intervention, it depends, but you pretty much also always want to accept this event unless you are really late into the game and need like 40 research points every 5 days. And the 5th event, being exclusive military contracts, is probably the best event out of them all. In exchange for 25 political power, a flat amount of 5 corruption, and a corruption gain of 0.25, you get some of the best modifiers in the game. Minus 25% military cost and upkeep is absolutely insane. If you also have nationalism, that is a 56% decrease in military upkeep. Absolutely insane. And you also get like double the money of a corporate dealing event or backdoor arms contract. But this event isn't only useful for war. The building cost reduction is also pretty decent, and combine that with other policies and you can also use this event to spam development. Not picking this event is confusing, but you do need to have a chief judge for this one if you get the event early in the game, since 0.25 corruption gain can get really expensive if you only have anti-corruption spending as your countermeasure and you have been invading a lot. Those 5 events are the ones you want to look out for. All the other events that give some sort of corruption, you just want to deny. Like, come on. This is a joke. We have come to the tips and tricks section. I am not planning on making this a long section, since I also included some tips in my first economy guide, but anyways, here are the tips. First up, we have development. We have established time and time again that tax income is just simply superior to resource income, and development is the best way to increase your tax income. So, how do we develop as cheaply as possible? First of all, developments have a higher return on investment the lower the tier of the city is. So developing from 1 to 2 is more profitable than 4 to 5 as an example. Therefore, when developing, you want to mostly focus on developing newly conquered land. Then there's also 4 different leaders and 3 policies that you can use to reduce the cost of your development. You have improved infrastructure, the Mass Construction Act, and ignore safety regulations. The neat thing about the last 2 is that their initial political power cost is pretty cheap, so you don't need to keep these up at all times. When you want to develop, simply turn these on, and after you've clicked on the develop city button, just remove them and you still get the building cost reduction modifier. Another tip if you're desperate for money is invading the Caribbean. This small area of micronations basically take no time to justify on, and each nation provides you with at least 75 million to your treasury. There are some billions to be made here in just a year. And you also get free airports on top of that. Pretty surprising that I don't see a lot of players invading this area in public servers. My final tip of the day is to subscribe and like to stay updated when I'm posting more tips. Bye bye!